battlefield stretched across a desolate expanse, its sky painted with streaks of fire and smoke. The air was thick with the echoes of battle, the whine of energy weapons, the dull thud of explosions, and the cries of soldiers fighting for survival. On this barren wasteland, where alien sands met human blood, a single act would change the fate of two worlds. She emerged from the haze like a phantom, her lithe cobalt-blue figure moving with predatory grace. Her eyes glowed faintly, a haunting mix of silver and violet that seemed to pierce through the chaos around her. The alien warrior was clad in an intricate armor that shimmered like liquid metal, its design both elegant and lethal. Her kind were feared across the galaxy, a species bred for war, their reputation built on centuries of conquest. Yet, as deadly as she appeared, there was a strange calmness in her movements, as though the battle around her was beneath her notice. The human soldier crouched behind a crumbling barricade, his breathing ragged. His armor, though advanced, bore the scars of a brutal skirmish. He clutched his weapon tightly, its barrel still smoking from earlier shots. He had been separated from his unit, left to fend for himself in the heart of enemy territory. His training screamed at him to stay hidden, to avoid drawing attention, but his instincts told him he was already being watched. And then he saw her. The alien's gaze locked onto his, her expression unreadable. For a moment, time seemed to stretch thin, the chaos of the battlefield fading into the background. She tilted her head slightly, as if studying him, and then began to approach. Her steps were deliberate, unhurried, each one carrying the weight of inevitability. He raised his weapon, the trembling in his hands betraying the resolve in his eyes. "Stop!" he shouted, his voice hoarse. "Don't come any closer." She didn't stop. Every survival instinct screamed at him to pull the trigger, to end the threat before it reached him. Yet something about her demeanor held him back. There was no malice in her movements, no overt hostility. It was as if she wasn't here to kill him, at least not yet. And so he hesitated, a hesitation that could have cost him his life. In a blur of motion, she closed the distance between them. He barely had time to react before she disarmed him with a fluid swipe, sending his weapon clattering to the ground. She was faster, stronger, and far more skilled than he could have anticipated. Before he could even think of retrieving his weapon, she had him pinned against the barricade, her hand gripping the front of his armor. Her face was inches from his, and he could feel the strange electric hum of her presence. "Why don't you fight?" she demanded, her voice a low, melodic growl that carried an otherworldly resonance. Her language was unfamiliar, yet he understood her perfectly, as if her words bypassed his ears and spoke directly to his mind. "I don't." He struggled to find the words. "I don't want to kill you." For the first time, her expression flickered. Confusion? Amusement? It was hard to tell. She released him abruptly, stepping back as if his answer had physically pushed her away. The soldier staggered, but remained standing, his heart pounding in his chest. "You had the chance to strike," she said, her tone softer now, though no less intense. "Yet you chose not to." "Why?" He swallowed hard, his mouth dry. "Because this isn't what I signed up for. I'm not here to slaughter anyone. I'm just trying to survive, like you." Her piercing gaze seemed to search his soul, weighing his words against some unseen measure. Then, she did something he never expected. She lowered her weapon. The elegant blade she had drawn earlier, its edge glowing faintly with a dangerous energy, was deactivated with a flick of her wrist. She stood before him, unarmed, a gesture that felt both bold and deeply unsettling. "Survive," she repeated, almost to herself. "Is that all humans fight for?" He didn't know how to answer. The truth was, he didn't fully understand why they were fighting anymore. The war had been going on for so long that its original purpose had become buried beneath layers of politics, propaganda, and bloodshed. All he knew was that he wanted it to end. And now, standing before this alien warrior who could have easily killed him but hadn't, he saw the faintest glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, it could. But the moment of fragile peace was shattered by a distant explosion, followed by the unmistakable sound of reinforcements arriving. The soldier turned to see his comrades advancing, their weapons raised and ready. They had spotted the alien and were preparing to engage. "Wait!" he shouted, raising his hands. "Don't shoot." His plea fell on deaf ears. The soldiers opened fire, their shots lighting up the battlefield once more. The alien warrior moved with impossible speed, dodging and weaving through the barrage of energy blasts. She could have fought back, could have easily turned the tide against them. But instead, she hesitated. Her gaze flickered back to the human soldier, as if silently asking him a question he couldn't answer. And then she was gone, disappearing into the smoke and chaos as quickly as she had appeared. The soldiers around him cheered, assuming they had driven the enemy away. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something far more significant had just occurred. As the battlefield fell quiet once more, the soldier found himself staring into the distance, his mind racing. Who was she? Why had she spared him? And why did he feel like their encounter was only the beginning of something much larger? He didn't have the answers. Not yet. But he knew one thing for certain. This war was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding the enemy, understanding himself, and understanding what it truly meant to fight for something worth living for. Unbeknownst to him, the alien warrior was watching from the shadows, her mind equally troubled. She had seen something in that human, something she couldn't quite explain. Mercy? Compassion? Weakness? Or, perhaps, strength of a kind she had never known. The battlefield would remember their encounter, though neither of them could yet grasp its significance. For in that brief moment of connection, a seed had been planted, a seed that would grow into a story far greater than either of them could imagine. The alien warrior's trembling hands faltered as the human soldier's gaze met hers, filled not with the triumphant cruelty she'd expected, but with a strange, quiet understanding. The silence between them grew heavier, and the hum of the distant battlefield seemed to dim, as though even the chaos around them hesitated to intrude. She tightened her grip on her weapon, her instincts warring with a feeling she could neither name nor comprehend. The soldier stood motionless, his hands outstretched in a gesture of peace. His armor, battered and streaked with dirt and ash, bore the scars of countless battles. Yet, in this moment, he looked anything but a conqueror. The alien's sharp, slitted eyes darted across his features, searching for a trap, a sign of deceit. She found none. Instead, she saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the weight of a lifetime of choices and consequences. It mirrored the burden she carried herself. For a fleeting second, her mind replayed the scenes that had brought her to this point. Her people, proud and unyielding, had fought tooth and claw against the human forces. They had been invaders, she had believed, usurpers of a world that did not belong to them. But as the war dragged on, truths she had once taken for granted began to unravel. The humans spoke of survival, of desperation, of a planet on the brink of collapse that had forced them to seek refuge among the stars. And now, Here she stood, facing one of those very humans, a soldier who should have been her mortal enemy, but who now looked at her as though she were something more. She thought of her unit, her sisters in arms who had fallen in battle. Their faces flashed before her mind's eye, a haunting reminder of the cost of war. They had fought with honor, with fury, and with the unwavering belief that they were protecting their kind. But what if they had been wrong? What if the stories their leaders had told them had been twisted to serve a purpose she could no longer support? The soldier's voice, low and steady, broke through her spiraling thoughts. "You don't have to do this," he said. There was no fear in his tone, no pleading, only sincerity. I've seen enough killing. Haven't you?" Her fingers twitched on the weapon's trigger. His words hit her like a blow. Hadn't she? The battlefield stretched behind them, littered with the wreckage of machines and the still lifeless forms of those who had fought and fallen. The stench of smoke and blood hung heavy in the air. It was a scene she had witnessed too many times, but for the first time, she felt its weight pressing down on her chest like a crushing tide. The soldier's outstretched hand wavered slightly, but he didn't lower it. "We're not so different, you and I," he said. "Both fighting for something bigger than ourselves. But maybe we've both lost sight of what that really means." Her heart thundered in her chest. The edges of her vision blurred, and she struggled to maintain her composure. His words, simple yet profound, dug into her soul in a way she hadn't expected. She thought of the stories she had been told about humans, their ruthlessness, their greed, their insatiable hunger for domination. Yet here was one, standing before her, offering not a fight but a chance. A chance for what? She didn't know. But the very act of it was enough to shake her. A voice crackled in her earpiece, sharp and urgent. It was her commander, barking orders, demanding to know why she had not yet finished the job. The sound jolted her back to the present, and she stiffened. Her gaze darted to the soldier, who had heard the faint transmission. His jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His trust in her, misplaced or not, was unshaken. "You need to go," she hissed, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her pulse. "If they see you alive." She didn't finish the sentence. The consequences were clear. Yet even as she spoke, she made no move to raise her weapon. The soldier shook his head. "Not without you." Her breath caught. "What?" "Come with me," he said, his voice firm but gentle. "There's another way out of this. For both of us." She stared at him, incredulous. The idea was unthinkable. To abandon her post, her people, everything she had ever known. It was madness. And yet, a part of her, buried deep beneath layers of duty and discipline, yearned to believe him. The sound of approaching footsteps snapped her attention back to reality. Reinforcements. Her comrades were closing in, and they would show no mercy to an enemy soldier. She glanced back at him, torn between conflicting loyalties. He must have seen the hesitation in her eyes, because he stepped closer, lowering his voice to a whisper. "I don't know what's waiting for us out there," he said, "but I do know that if we stay here, neither of us is walking away. This is our only chance." Her mind raced. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the faint hum of energy weapons being primed. Time was running out. She took one last look at the soldier, his expression unwavering despite the danger surrounding them. And then, against every instinct screaming at her to do otherwise, she made her choice. Dropping her weapon, she reached out and grabbed his hand. The soldier's eyes widened in surprise, but he didn't hesitate. Together, They turned and ran, disappearing into the shadows as the sound of reinforcements echoed behind them. The battlefield, once their prison, now stretched before them as a vast, uncertain expanse. As they ran, she couldn't help but wonder, had she made the right decision? Or had she just sealed her fate and his with a single act of defiance? The answers lay ahead, hidden in the unknown. But for the first time in her life, she felt something that had eluded her for so long: hope. The blue-skinned alien remained frozen in place, her breaths coming quick and shallow as the human soldier's outstretched hand hovered between them. The gesture, meant as a truce, seemed to burn brighter in the cold, desolate terrain of the battlefield. Her dark, reflective eyes flicked to his face, searching for any sign of deception, any indication that this could be a trap. But all she saw was something that defied every warning, every lesson drilled into her since childhood: compassion. Behind them, the silence of the battlefield was oppressive. Smoke rose from the charred remains of vehicles and weapons, the distant hum of retreating spacecraft, a faint reminder of the chaos that had raged only hours before. The air carried the acrid smell of burned metal and scorched earth, mingled with the faint, metallic tang of blood. Yet here, in this fleeting, fragile moment, there was an inexplicable stillness. It was as though the universe itself paused, waiting to see what would happen next. The soldier's hand trembled slightly, though his gaze remained steady. He was younger than she'd expected. His features, though marred with cuts and dirt, still bore the softness of someone unaccustomed to prolonged war. His uniform, though battered, still clung to him with an air of resilience. He seemed out of place on this barren battlefield, like a flicker of warmth in a landscape of desolation. And yet, he stood there, offering her something she could scarcely comprehend. Her kind had been told stories of humans, violent, unpredictable, and merciless creatures who thrived on conquest and destruction. And yet, this man's actions contradicted everything she'd been taught. Her instincts screamed at her to strike, to end this perceived vulnerability before it turned into a threat. But her body, betraying her training, remained still. There was something in his eyes that she couldn't ignore: a depth, a plea, a challenge to see him as more than an enemy. She glanced at the blade in her hand, its edge still gleaming with the faintest trace of his blood. She'd had the upper hand just moments ago. His weapon had fallen to the ground when she disarmed him, and her strength, her skill, had rendered him defenseless. She could have ended him then. Yet, instead of finishing her mission, she had hesitated. And now, here they were, locked in this impossible stalemate. Why? The question slipped from her lips before she could stop it. Her voice, though firm, carried an undertone of disbelief. It was the first word either of them had spoken since their confrontation began. The soldier's brow furrowed, his lips parting as though the answer wasn't immediately clear to him either. "Because it doesn't have to end like this," he said softly, his voice steady but laced with an edge of desperation. "We're not so different. I don't want to be the reason another life is lost today." Her grip on the blade tightened instinctively. The words hung in the air, heavy with implications. She'd heard humans speak of peace before, but it was always a precursor to betrayal, a momentary distraction before the killing blow. Yet, this man's tone carried a sincerity that made her chest tighten in a way she didn't understand. Her people's warriors were trained to resist emotion, to push through the fog of doubt and act with precision and purpose. But standing here, facing an opponent who refused to act like one, she found herself unmoored. She searched his face for cracks, for signs of falsehood, but all she saw was raw honesty. It was infuriating. Above them, the sky shifted ominously, dark clouds swirling as the aftermath of the battle continued to ripple through the atmosphere. The faint crackle of distant energy weapons reminded them both that this fragile pause couldn't last. Reinforcements would come, and with them, the crushing weight of duty and expectation. This fleeting moment of humanity, or whatever it was, would be snuffed out like a candle in a storm. "You think mercy will save you?" she asked, her voice colder now, though the faintest tremor betrayed her inner conflict. "Your kind spares only to gain advantage. What makes you different?" The soldier's expression hardened slightly, not in anger, but in resolve. He lowered his hands slowly, not in retreat, but in a gesture of respect. "Maybe I'm not different," he admitted. "Maybe I'm just as flawed as every other human you fought. But I know this, if we keep fighting like this, neither of us wins. Someone has to stop. Someone has to choose something else." The words struck a chord she didn't want to acknowledge. Her mind raced with memories of her training, of her commander's voices drilling into her the importance of loyalty and victory at all costs. But beneath those memories lurked others, the faces of comrades lost, the hollow victories that left her feeling emptier with each passing battle. Was this human offering her a way out of the endless cycle? Or was it just another ploy? The sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment like glass. Her head snapped toward the noise, her muscles tensing as she prepared for another confrontation. A group of human soldiers emerged from the haze, their weapons drawn, their expressions a mix of confusion and alarm as they took in the scene before them. The blue-skinned alien warrior standing face to face with their comrade, her blade still in hand, her expression unreadable. The human soldier in front of her stepped back slightly, raising a hand toward his approaching allies. "Wait! Don't shoot!" he called out, his voice commanding despite the tension in his tone. The other soldiers hesitated, their weapons still trained on her but their fingers off the triggers. The alien warrior's heart pounded in her chest as she calculated her next move. She was outnumbered now, and the fragile balance of power between her and the soldier had shifted dramatically. Yet, despite the odds, she didn't feel the panic she expected. Instead, a strange clarity settled over her. She had a choice to make, one that could change everything. She took a slow, deliberate step back, her gaze never leaving the soldier who had spared her. Her grip on the blade loosened slightly, though she didn't lower it completely. "If you're lying," she said quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made the human soldiers tense, "I will find you. And I won't hesitate next time." The soldier nodded, his expression unreadable but his eyes burning with intensity. "Fair enough," he replied. With one last look at the group of humans, the alien turned and began to retreat into the shadows of the battlefield. The human soldiers watched her go, their confusion evident, but none of them moved to stop her. The man she'd spared stood silently, his heart still racing as he processed what had just happened. In the distance, the alien warrior disappeared into the haze, her figure blending with the smoke and shadows. But the encounter lingered in her mind, a seed of doubt and curiosity taking root despite her efforts to suppress it. She didn't know what the future held, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. The silence that followed the alien fighter's revelation was more deafening than any explosion. The human soldier, frozen in place, tried to process her words. Everything about her demeanor seemed different now, as if her earlier ferocity had given way to something deeper, more primal, an emotion that surpassed mere survival. She shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between him and the shimmering energy field behind her. He could see it now, faint yet undeniable, a distortion in the air that seemed alive, pulsating with an unnatural rhythm. Whatever lay beyond it was the key to all of this. He was sure of it. "What is that?" he asked, his voice low, careful not to break the fragile thread of trust they had just begun to weave. She hesitated, her fists clenching and unclenching as though debating whether to answer. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a passage to another place. A place where none of this matters." Her words hung in the air, cryptic and unsettling. "Your people wouldn't understand. They think in straight lines, in victories and losses. But this is different." He took a cautious step closer, his rifle still slung across his back, a deliberate gesture of non-aggression. "Help me understand," he urged. "You said I'm not like the others. Prove it." Her gaze softened, but only slightly. "This war isn't what you think it is," she said. "Your leaders tell you it's about territory, resources, survival. But it's bigger than that. Bigger than you, or me, or any of this." She gestured to the desolate landscape around them. Before he could respond, a low rumble shook the ground beneath their feet. The energy field flickered, its pulse growing erratic. Her eyes widened in alarm. "They're coming," she said, her voice tinged with urgency. "We don't have much time." "Who's coming?" he demanded, but she was already moving, her lithe form a blur as she darted toward the field. He followed instinctively, his training kicking in even as his mind reeled with questions. She stopped just short of the shimmering distortion, her hands moving in a series of rapid, precise gestures. The air around her seemed to ripple in response, and for a moment, he thought he saw something, a shadow, or perhaps a reflection, too fleeting to grasp. "Listen to me," she said, turning to face him. "You have to make a choice. If you cross this threshold, there's no going back. Everything you know, everything you believe, will change." He hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "Why me?" he asked. "Why not one of your own?" Her expression darkened, a flicker of pain crossing her face. "Because they've already made their choice," she said. "And it led us here." Before he could press her further, a piercing sound split the air, sharp and relentless. He recognized it instantly, the telltale whine of incoming enemy drones. She cursed under her breath, her composure cracking for the first time. "They found us," she said. "We need to move. Now." He glanced back toward the ridge, where he'd left his squad, the distant shapes of their vehicles barely visible against the horizon. For a fleeting moment, he considered turning back, rejoining the familiar chaos of war. But something about her, her conviction, her desperation kept him rooted in place. "What happens if I don't go with you?" he asked, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. She met his gaze, her eyes blazing with a mix of fear and defiance. "Then you'll never know the truth, and neither will they." The ground shook again, more violently this time, as a shadow passed overhead. He looked up to see a formation of drones descending rapidly, their sleek metallic forms glinting in the dim light. They moved with eerie precision, their weapons already locked on target. "Go!" she shouted, shoving him toward the energy field. He stumbled forward, the heat of an explosion searing the air behind him as the first drone fired. He turned just in time to see her raise her arms, a shimmering barrier forming around her as she faced the onslaught head-on. The sight was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. For a split second, he considered staying, fighting alongside her, but the urgency in her voice, The raw determination in her eyes pushed him forward. Taking a deep breath, he stepped into the shimmering distortion, the world around him dissolving into a blinding cascade of light. And then everything went silent. The air was heavy with tension as the alien fighter and the human soldiers stood on the precipice of their final confrontation. The desert wind swirled around them, carrying the echoes of distant explosions and the hum of approaching reinforcements. The soldier's grip on his weapon tightened, but he didn't raise it. His heart pounded, not with fear, but with the weight of the decision that loomed before him. His mission had been clear: neutralize all threats. Yet, in this moment, the lines between threat and ally had blurred beyond recognition. The alien fighter's expression was unreadable. Her luminous eyes locked on his with an intensity that seemed to pierce his very soul. Her earlier words echoed in his mind. She took a step closer, her movements deliberate and unthreatening, but her presence radiated power. The soldier's instincts screamed at him to act, but a deeper voice, the one that had stayed his hand earlier, urged him to wait, to listen. "You think this war is about survival," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "But it's not. It's about control. Your leaders and mine, they fear what they cannot dominate. That's why they pit us against each other. But there's something they fear even more than defeat. They fear unity." The soldier's mind raced, trying to process her words. He had been trained to follow orders without question. Yet here she was, challenging everything he thought he knew about the war and his role in it. And then, as if to drive her point home, the sound of distant aircraft grew louder. He turned his head slightly, enough to see the silhouettes of human and alien ships approaching from opposite directions. Reinforcements were coming, but they weren't allies. They were two armies converging on a single battlefield. The alien fighter followed his gaze, her expression hardening. "They'll kill us both if we let them, but it doesn't have to end that way." Before he could respond, a deafening explosion shook the ground beneath their feet. The reinforcements had arrived, and they were wasting no time. Dust and debris filled the air as missiles rained down, tearing apart the landscape. The soldier instinctively dove for cover, his training kicking in, but he kept his eyes on the alien fighter. She had taken cover as well, her shimmering armor barely visible through the haze. For a moment, their eyes met again, and he saw something he hadn't expected: trust. Summoning his courage, he motioned for her to follow him. They sprinted through the chaos, dodging gunfire and explosions until they found temporary shelter in the wreckage of an old vehicle. Breathing heavily, the soldier turned to her. "What's your plan?" he demanded, his voice rough but steady. She hesitated, as if weighing how much to reveal. "There's a command center, not far from here," she said. "If we can reach it, we might be able to override their targeting systems. Force them to stand down. And you think they'll just let us walk in?" He shot back, his skepticism evident. "No," she admitted. "But we don't have to fight them all. Just long enough to upload the override." He stared at her, his mind a whirlwind of doubt and determination. Trusting her felt like a gamble, but he knew the alternative: continuing to fight an unwinnable war was no better. With a nod, he signaled for her to lead the way. The journey to the command center was harrowing. They moved under the cover of darkness, using the terrain to their advantage, but the constant threat of discovery loomed over them. Along the way, they encountered scattered groups of soldiers from both sides. Each encounter was a test of their fragile alliance, but somehow they managed to avoid direct confrontation. The soldier couldn't help but notice the alien fighter's restraint, her efforts to minimize casualties even when it put them at greater risk. When they finally reached the command center, they found it heavily guarded. The soldier's heart sank at the sight of the fortified building, its walls bristling with weapons and sensors. "This is suicide," he muttered, but the alien fighter was already scanning the perimeter, her expression resolute. "There's a weak point," she said, pointing to a section of the wall where the defenses were less concentrated. "It's risky, but it's our best chance." They moved quickly, their every step a calculated risk. The soldiers' pulse raced as they breached the perimeter, disabling guards with a combination of precision and stealth. Inside, the command center was a labyrinth of corridors and control rooms. The alien fighter seemed to know exactly where to go, leading them to a central console surrounded by a web of cables and monitors. "This is it," she said, her fingers flying over the controls. The soldier stood guard, his weapon at the ready, as she worked. The sound of approaching footsteps sent a chill down his spine. "Hurry," he urged, his voice low but urgent. "Almost there," she replied, her focus unshaken. And then, just as the footsteps grew unbearably close, the override was complete. The monitors flickered, displaying a cascade of code that signaled the targeting systems had been disabled. The soldier exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. "Did it work?" he asked, but before she could answer, the door burst open. A squad of heavily armed soldiers flooded the room, their weapons trained on the pair. For a moment, time seemed to freeze. The soldier tightened his grip on his weapon, ready to fight, but the alien fighter raised her hands in a gesture of surrender. "Wait," she shouted, her voice cutting through the tension. "We've stopped the attack. The war doesn't have to continue." The soldiers hesitated, their expressions a mix of confusion and hostility. And then, from behind them, a commanding voice rang out. "Stand down. Let them speak." A figure stepped forward, their presence commanding respect. It was a high-ranking officer, their uniform bearing the insignia of authority. The soldier's heart pounded as the officer approached, their gaze shifting between him and the alien fighter. "You have one chance to explain," the officer said, their tone cold but curious. The alien fighter stepped forward, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "This war is a lie," she said. "We've been manipulated into fighting each other while those in power profit from our destruction. But we have a choice. We can end this together." Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and defiance. The soldier watched the officer's face, searching for any sign of understanding. And then, to his astonishment, the officer lowered their weapon. "Prove it," they said. The alien fighter nodded, her expression determined. "Follow me," she said, leading them to the console. As she began to reveal the evidence she had uncovered, the soldier felt a surge of hope. For the first time, it seemed possible that the cycle of violence could be broken. But just as the tension began to ease, an alarm blared. The room was bathed in red light as the monitors displayed a new threat, an autonomous fleet of drones programmed to eliminate all targets indiscriminately. The soldier's blood ran cold as he realized the true scope of the danger. The war wasn't just between humans and aliens. It was a battle for survival against a force that answered to no one. The alien fighter's eyes met his, her expression fierce and unyielding. "This isn't over," she said. "We have to fight together." The battlefield was eerily silent in the aftermath. The alien fighter, who once stood with defiance, now seemed smaller as she glanced at the human soldier with a mix of respect and regret. He had spared her life, a decision that echoed louder than any act of violence. The other soldiers began to lower their weapons, unsure of what came next, but unwilling to disrupt this fragile moment of understanding. As the alien woman finally spoke, her voice trembled, though it carried the weight of her people. "You could have killed me," she said, her alien accent thick but comprehensible. "Why didn't you?" The human soldier, still catching his breath, looked at her with a weary but resolute gaze. "Because if we're ever going to survive, it won't be through more death. It'll be through understanding." His words lingered in the air, a stark contrast to the chaos that had preceded them. The alien's silver eyes softened, and she nodded slowly. She reached up to touch the emblem on her chest, a symbol of her allegiance, and then tore it off, letting it fall to the ground. The sound of the metal clinking against the dirt was subtle, but it resonated deeply with everyone present. It was a symbolic gesture, one that signified a shift no one had anticipated. Word of the encounter spread quickly through both factions. Leaders on each side convened, some reluctantly, others with cautious optimism. The alien woman, now an outcast among her people, stood beside the human soldier as they addressed the assembly. Together, they spoke of the futility of their conflict, the destruction it had wrought, and the potential for a different path forward. There were, of course, skeptics. Some humans and aliens alike refused to believe that peace was possible. They had lost too much, seen too many atrocities to trust the other side. But as days turned into weeks, the ripple effects of that singular moment on the battlefield began to take shape. Small pockets of cooperation emerged, shared resources, joint patrols, and exchanges of knowledge. It wasn't perfect, and tensions still flared, but it was progress. The human soldier and the alien woman, now reluctant symbols of a fragile truce, found themselves thrust into roles neither had sought. They traveled together, speaking to communities on both sides, sharing their story and advocating for unity. Their bond, forged in the crucible of conflict, grew stronger with each passing day. They didn't always agree, and their cultural differences often led to misunderstandings, but they learned from each other in ways that transcended words. As the months turned into years, the war that had once seemed endless became a distant memory. New generations grew up hearing stories of the alien warrior who defied her own people and the human soldier who chose mercy over vengeance. They became legends, their actions a reminder of the power of empathy and the courage it took to break the cycle of hatred. In the end, it wasn't a grand treaty or a decisive battle that brought peace. It was the small, everyday acts of kindness and cooperation that slowly eroded the walls of mistrust. The alien woman and the human soldier faded into the background, content to let others carry the torch they had lit. They found solace in the knowledge that their actions had sparked a change far greater than themselves. One evening, as the sun set over a landscape that had once been scarred by war, the two sat together in quiet reflection. The alien woman looked at the horizon, her silver eyes shimmering in the fading light. "Do you think we've done enough?" she asked softly. The human soldier smiled faintly, his gaze fixed on the same horizon. "I think we've shown them what's possible. The rest is up to them." She nodded, a sense of peace washing over her. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel so uncertain. It wasn't perfect, and there would undoubtedly be challenges ahead, but it was a future worth fighting for, not with weapons, but with hope. And so, as the stars began to emerge in the night sky, they sat together in silence, two souls from different worlds united by a shared belief in the better angels of their nature. Their story was far from over, but it was no longer theirs alone. It belonged to everyone who dared to imagine a world where compassion triumphed over conflict, where understanding bridged the divide, and where even the most bitter of enemies could find common ground.